We get. I didn't think that far ahead, Ms. Rhonda. Sorry about that. Um, well, I think we're a little past the hour. I know some other meetings were taking place, so we're going to try to wait and make sure the members of the subcommittee were available. But um, I guess we'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. We've got a few bills on the agenda today. If y'all don't mind, I'll open us up in a brief word of prayer. Or Representative Bernal, would you mind doing that? You did such a fine job yesterday. I call on you, spot call, please.
Bringing us here safely. And we pray that the work that we do will be fair to all Georgians, and that we continue to pray for our people individuals who have COVID-19. And we just pray for our country, Lord, that you would help us to know to do the right thing. These and other blessings we ask in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. We'll just go kind of in numerical order, if that's all right, starting with House Bill 491. And I haven't really done this before, where I'm presenting the bill and chairing the meeting. So if anybody catches me doing anything, please call me on it. I'm going to try to do this and answer questions and do the best we can. But House Bill 491 actually is part of this sequence of bills. They're together. I think back when we had our first investigations back in June, there were some things that stood out as far as checks and balances. We saw a lot of finger pointing, and so we're trying to establish, and what these bills are intended to do, starting with this one, is to add some transparency, add some checks, and add some balances, and make sure that the separation of powers is proper. I think this just actually sheds a little bit of light on the emergency rules that are passed, and it requests that notification be given and some explanations required of the SEB when it comes to implementing or voting or putting forward any emergency rules, what it is that they're trying to do. I don't know if anybody signed up to speak to this particular bill. I don't see anybody. There is one suggested change on line 16. The 7-day notice is probably, I think, is gathered from a regular rulemaking, and in an emergency situation, I don't think that the SEB should probably we should require 7 days. The notice of the public would need to, I think, probably be as soon as possible in accordance with the second listing on the bill. Any questions? I think it would be, in accordance with number 2. I think is Jeff Lanier on the phone? I mean, on the line. Jeff, are you available to possibly suggest some language that would allow?
I'm on the line, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to get the bill up in front of me here electronically.
It just says on line 16, give at least 7 days notice to the public of its intended actions. That's probably a little much regarding an emergency rule when you may have to make it, quickly.
Yeah. What's that LC number?
It is LC 470840. Do you have a question, Representative Burnell?
I just wanted to know, what does imminent peril mean?
You're number 4. I think I've got your mic on. You just don't have the mics kind of. There you go.
I'm sorry. What does imminent peril mean?
On which line?
It's on line 13.
I think that's in accordance with the emergency provision. so that if it's, obviously in a situation of a dire situation, that just happens to be the verbiage that aligns with the emergency rule.
Okay. And what happened? I think you kind of told us, but what happened in the past cycle that made this bill necessary? Was there anything in particular?
Well, I think what we found is that some of these emergency rules were made without any real notification or oversight. And I think this just reinforces that, we'd like to be aware of those up front, and we'd like to be able to at least weigh in potentially. It's done on regular rules, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
when it comes through governmental affairs. And so this was just an attempt to add a little transparency to the process,
Okay.
even in an emergency situation.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. We do have somebody that's wanted to speak to this. This is Ms. Marks with the Coalition for Good Government. I'm not sure how to, if you want to unmute yourself, Ms. Marks, you can.
Okay, can
There
you
you
hear me?
go. We
All
can.
right, great. Thank you so much, Chairman Blackmon and committee members. I'll be very brief here. Coalition for Good Governance, and I'm the executive director, is a small nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we are focused on election security and transparency of elections, as well as voter privacy. We have been out in the field in real polling places, in real election offices during elections for the last 2 years. We've spent hundreds of hours of time as appointed poll monitors, poll watchers, and we have an understanding of how many of these rules actually impact live elections. And I just want to say about this emergency rule proposal that you have, that we fully endorse it. We believe it is really needed, because what we've seen is the Secretary of State and the State Election Board promulgate rules this last year that they put them under the emergency category when they were not indeed emergencies that imperiled the health and safety of the community. What they did is they made these rules to evade the General Assembly's review. And then they continued to make the rules and renew them without the General Assembly seeing them as has been intended for a long time in the statutes. So I just want to say that we have seen what happens when rules get made in this kind of fashion, and we think that there need to be more checks and balances, just as you are proposing in this bill, and we fully endorse it. So thank you for bringing this. While I'm on, may I go ahead and comment on your other two bills, or do you want me to wait?
No, that'd be fine if you have a comment or two.
Okay, all right. We would endorse the idea of the more checks and balances being put into the the State Election Board, by having the Secretary of State become an ex officio member, a non-voting member. And that is really because the Georgia,
192. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Marks.
because the Georgia Secretary of State has such unbelievable power, more so than any other state that we are aware of. And so the checks and balances here is a good idea. And then your next bill on temporary control of county boards. We are very concerned that, in fact, more checks and balances need to be added here. Therefore, we would suggest more restraint be put into that bill by requiring judicial review before the State Election Board can take temporary control of the county board. We would suggest that it needs to go to Superior Court judge, preferably away from the home county that is being the target of the potential takeover. We're just worried, based on our experience, that the State Election Board could easily abuse their power in an arbitrary and capricious manner. So we would urge that more controls be put in before the state board could take this kind of drastic action. And thank you very much for allowing me to comment. And of course, I'm happy to take any question.
Anybody have a question for Ms. Marks?
On her House Bill 493,
Um,
the last one she talked about?
yes, ma'am. What number are you? 3?
Two,
2.
I think. Yes, thank you. Ms. Marsh, when you suggested for judicial review and suggested the Superior Court judge, um, th- that in using that avenue would take much longer than normally to get an answer. So you're adding probably weeks to this. There's something called the administrative law judge. I don't know if that would apply in this area, but they work with state agencies and might be more responsive. In other words, I think there's not a simple explanation for judicial review, and we probably need to be advised on what's the best avenue for judicial review.
And thank you.
Yeah, please, if you'd like to answer, Ms. Marks.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, in fact, we do think it would add weeks to the process. And that is more or less the goal, is to make sure that a real Superior Court judge, and preferably done the same way as an election contest is done, where a judge in the home county who so that is not the judge hearing the case, that it has that level of independence, so that the judge is not an elector in the county. And so a judge would be brought in from a neighboring district to hear the case. And indeed, our concept is that based on some of the actions that have been fairly arbitrary and capricious on the part of the state election board, could have the moderation and restraint that the judicial system would give it. And we, in fact, are recommending not going through the administrative law process, but instead going through the state's judicial system as it's constructed, with all the appeals that you could have.
Is that Chair Lady Smith, do you have anything further?
I think it's a debatable area of this bill. That's what I'm trying to point out.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Marks. You're welcome to stand by in case anything else was to come up regarding that. If there are no more questions on 491, I don't believe anybody else is signed up to speak. We'll move on to House Bill 492, which, as mentioned, once again, I think looking at the checks and balances, and we look at different agencies across kind of our state, and you typically don't see a commissioner, say, for instance, of the technical college system serving on the board, much less as the chair of that particular board. So I think what this is intended to do from a check and balance standpoint is it takes our chief elections officer, they force on the execution and enforcement of the laws and the rules, and then the board is thereby tasked more so with actually passing any rules, either emergency or regular rules within that. I could go through the bill. It's I think it's relatively straightforward. It allows for the appointment of an independent, nonpartisan chair, and that is by the governor and approved by 3/5 vote of the General Assembly. And then it says the Secretary of State on page 4 would provide any resources needed to the State Elections Board to carry out any duties that it may require. That's the short of the bill. Is there anybody here that wants to speak to it or have any questions regarding Representative Brown?
Thank you. Since I've been down here serving in the House, I have been on governmental affairs and on the election subcommittee. And I know that that Fulton County is a county that is always brought up. There's always something about Fulton County. And so I would just like to know what will prevent the legislature from retaliating against a particular person or board, election board.
Um, or you may be thinking of 493. This is strictly
Oh, okay.
changes the makeup of the state elections board.
Okay, well, what would prevent the legislature from retaliating against the state board of election chairperson?
Well, actually, there is recourse now that allows us to deal with state election board members. So there's already something in place that would allow the General Assembly to remove state election board members.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yes, sir. Dean Smyer.
But in this bill, the person that follow up with Representative Bernal, the person that would be appointed would be an appointee of the governor. Is that
Confirmed by 3/5
confirmed by
of the General Assembly? Yes, sir.
and the Secretary of State is elected as the supervisor of the election, so to speak, within the confinements of their duties of office. And I'm just concerned that you would place a person that would be appointed, and then at the same time would not be they would be responsible to the political subdivisions of but not to the people, and that would be my only concern. That now the people have a recourse in light of the fact the composition is made up of with the Secretary of State chairing it, and I can see adding a member to the board, but adding that person to the board, I have no problem with that. But but designating that person be the chairman, that poses to me an operational aspect, especially in light of the fact that the Secretary of State is elected with those responsibilities. So that would be my only concern.
Well, again, I mean, I fair point and point taken, sir. I just would, stress that it doesn't take the supervision of elections away from in the Secretary of State. It just would allow him to be an ex officio non-voting member of that board, and it would be run by somebody who is kind of set up as an independent based on all the language within the bill. So they would be responsible for chairing those meetings, which would, deal with the rules that may come up or any particular investigative type stuff. And so it is intended to take the partisanship out of the SEB at that chair level.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? I don't see any, or anybody else wish to speak to the bill? No? Okay. Well, move on to House Bill 493. I think we have a number of people signed up, or a couple of people signed up to speak to this. Just one, Mr. Edwards. Okay. Well, I'm going to briefly go through it. We've already talked about it. What this bill would do is, after an investigation and another hearing, it would allow the state election board to go in for as much as 18 months and administratively take over or run the elections within a particular county. There are restrictions as to how many that can be done at any given time. And so the state election board or the Secretary of State at its direction would be sent in and would assist that county to try to get it back going, get it back up on its feet. I think we saw some similar legislation a few years ago regarding our schools. And so the intent here is to help out when there's a problem and after a very thorough investigation has taken place, and go in and help that county. After 18 months, they do back out, and it's not a go in and fire everybody and get rid of everybody and start over. It is actually go in, help administrate for those 18 months, and then turn it back over. So, Mr. Edwards, I know you had some questions or you had some things you wanted to say. Does anybody have any questions before we get started, Miss Representative Burnell?
First, if you want him to.
Okay. All right. Sure. Any of these microphones would be fine, I think. All right. You got it. Floor's yours.
Y'all can hear me okay? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Again, my name is Todd Edwards. I'm the Deputy Legislative Director with ACCG, or the Association County Commissioners of Georgia. I'd like to start off, first of all, by commending our state's election officials, superintendents, those in charge of elections. I think sometimes that gets lost in some of the debate that's been going on this session. They did a tremendous job under unforeseen circumstances this past election.
I would
Combination,
agree with you.
yeah, a combination of the new machines. And I'm going to make this short. I won't belabor the point. The COVID-19 pandemic, the shortage of poll workers, changing polling locations, and the great influx of absentee ballots. I mean, there were challenges. There were great improvements made, particularly between the primary and the general election, and particularly in the metro counties. Social distancing always was a challenge. That said, no doubt, there are going to continue to be some instances where election directors, superintendents are underperforming or not following strict adherence to the laws. The remedy, I'm not certain. There are a lot of proposals, being discussed up here. I think having the state offer assistance, as your bill aims to do, I think that's good. I think that there are election officials, as mentioned, some problem, but keep in mind that every bill that's introduced, those coming into law, are going to have statewide implications. As Chairman Fleming said yesterday in discussing this bill, there's going to be a continued discussion, improvements made. There is some interest, I understand, in incorporating this, if it doesn't fly on its own, into the larger election bill being considered in the overall committee. The greatest concern by far of ACCG is having the state come over and assert direct control over a local election function, particularly why the county is responsible and has to pay for that. So in short, I don't know if the former election director, I don't know what you call it. Let's just call it director, whether it be the superintendent, probate judge. You certainly can't fire a probate judge, but are we paying two persons at once? It's not clear who's going to be funding that. We talked to counties. I think that's going to be their greatest concern. I will discuss.
What
yeah.
would be your recommendation as far as
the state funding it?
The funding? Would you keep the funding in place at the local, and any over and above that
Whether
would be borne by the state? Is that the suggestion of
if
yours?
There's going to be different circumstances. If we don't have it goes back to also who's control and over directions, who can hire and fire that individual. Is that I was about to get to that in a moment. Is the state election board? We have no control over that. We can't necessarily fire them, but now we're responsible for paying a state entity, is the way I read the bill, to come in and do it. Is that we saw in Fulton, does the board have responsibility? They thought they did, and they didn't. It went back to the county commission. So if we're going to be responsible county commissioners, and I'm not saying that every county commissioner wants this responsibility, but ultimately the person's accountable or responsible for paying for it should have some accountability over how it's run at the local level.
Well, I mean, just one other way to put that is if from an accountability standpoint, if you're running your elections and you don't have any problems and things don't come up, then you don't ever have to worry about any of this.
That's absolutely true. There are going to be circumstances, where this is needed. There's a current hearing process in law that this bill adds to, that calls for fines, et cetera. But this one, going through, again, these are issues that I've been asked to bring up to more carefully consider. And I think some of it can be addressed in Senate Bill 89. I know it's a Senate bill. It's by Butch Miller, Senator Miller. And he's got a similar bill and concept to deal with what they call underperforming election superintendents. But the Secretary of State's office can go in, they support, they assist. I know that's kind of mentioned in here, but they can actually do training, investigate the calls, oversee assistance, support services. There's a longer list of conditions, assistance, support, and I would say incentives before that ultimate decision is made. Should that bill cross or looking over? And again, this is, I don't know that I have all the answers, but this is something to consider if we're making this significant of a change in the overseeing or direct, what's the word? Direct control, asserting direct control over local elections. And ultimately, that bill does have at the end a way to remove it. And again, we would have the similar concerns with paying for it at the county level. I mentioned earlier, one of the big discussions, and it gets confusing, is who's in charge of hiring, firing local election superintendents or directors. Obviously, the 31 counties that have probate judges, they're constitutional officers. They're not necessarily accountable to counties, but yet we still have to fund them. If someone takes over their functions, are we able to reduce their pay for no longer having that responsibility at the local level? I think law, it prevents that, but that should be something that should be looked at. And then I've raised a lot of the concerns, the funding of it, and overall what we need to be considerate of is moving forward as more scrutiny is added, and it's understandable. Our elections are becoming closer in the state of Georgia. Mistakes are going to be made. Everyone's being scrutinized. We've got numerous bills with additional conditions, requirements, penalties on local election directors. Quite frankly, I think the unforeseen or impact or consequence of this is it's going to be harder to find people to do this job in the future. And stepping up, not only in this bill with the state offering assistance, intervening, removing, it may be something that we would like to discuss in the future as to what role and how extensive the state may wish to take on this responsibility, or at least have some sort of pool of officials who'd be willing to come in as these jobs become more difficult to fill.
I think there's a couple of questions, but again, I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Edwards. We're looking at trying to restore confidence.
Sure, I understand.
And again, some of these checks and balances are intended to do that very thing. I think we've seen for a few maybe the entire election cycle back in June 9th, I think we had a number of people come forward that were very concerned about long lines, and they were concerned about some of the things regarding these absentee by mail ballots that came in, and the number of applications that went out, and how it made things a little bit overwhelming and confusing, and from a resource perspective.
It was
at
all
the local
unprecedented.
level. Yes, sir. And there were obviously, numerous factors at play. So, we've heard a lot of testimony, a lot that, folks had issues and things come up, and things that I think were meant to be investigated, but maybe they were not necessarily investigated either. So I think, again, trying to restore confidence is, what these are intended to do, and want to work with you regarding any kind of mitigation on a financial end that's appropriate. But I think first and foremost, what we want to do is see, these things handled, the training, everything up front, and done properly up front. And then there's never any need to go to any of these kind of measures.
No, and that's perfectly understandable. The training, we're all for it. I think there needs to be more consistent training, not just over the election superintendents, but of staff as well. I think there's shared costs between state and local governments. We assume the vast majority of it at the county level. Others bills have efficiencies where we'll realize some savings on the election process, but any assistance, as mentioned, through the state on better training, on perhaps a team to come down and assist, perhaps acting directors that could temporarily, step in. I mean, those are all things I know that this committee, ACCG, and others would like to continue working on, should and as these bills progress, and be made perfected through the committee process, Mr. Chairman.
I welcome that continued discussion.
Yes, sir.
For sure. Thank you. Is this you, Representative Chairman Martin?
Mr. Edwards, you're back there somewhere.
Yeah,
We're
I'm sorry. Here,
deadly behind the. No, that's fine. It's just deadly behind the pole.
the pillar.
No, this is not going to surprise you when I bring this up, because you talk about we are funding, this, and the state's doing it, and we're still paying. I'm going to ask you a rhetorical question there. Who's we? The we, and
ultimately the funding comes from the county commissioners.
I just want,
but then ultimately the taxpayers.
Right.
But
I want to remind that's the point I wanted to get to. I want to remind you that the funding, whether it passes through the county commission, and I'm being argumentative, but somewhat agreeing with you that this is not new coming from me on various topics, is the job we have to do is make sure the voters in that county, whether the money passes for them through the county commission to whoever supervising elections, or from them through the county commission to the state or directly to the state. They want, a fair, transparent, open elections. And the fair county that I sit in now, I have gotten, calls for a number of years, blaming, the state for closing a precinct or blaming the state for the lines that happened, at the precinct at Piedmont Park in the June election. And those were the county, board to do it. So I think what the chairman's here, I guess my question is, can you, with your various member counties, work with us to make sure we deliver a result for the voters and a good outcome? I think that's what the chairman's trying to do in his vote here. I understand the Ms. Marks on video, and you here want to be careful about, heavy-handed and who's paying for what and so forth. But the ultimate goal here is to be responsive to the voters. And my question is, can we just all agree the money comes from the taxpaying voters of Georgia, and we want to deploy it and apply it in a way that gets them the best opportunity to vote, and perhaps as important, maybe more so, the appropriate chain of custody once their ballot is cast?
Let me see if I can keep track of the question there. Ultimately, yes, I will concur that ultimately the taxpayer is responsible. What we have in situations like this, and the precedent this sets, is the accountability that goes along with the funding. Good government and to the taxpayers, to the voters, to the public, is that those who are funding it should have some, or if not the responsibility or accountability of carrying out that function. So if, yes, the taxpayer is paying for it, but if the county is somehow ultimately responsible, but that's decisions taken away from them, how can they be held to be accountable in the process, or the tax funder paying process? You're separating the two. You're removing accountability. You're giving it to the state, and that's the concern of local governments.
If I may, I would agree with you. You are removing that. You're removing that accountability from the situation in a case where this bill would allow for it to be taken over for a period of time. And I think you're right. At that point, the state would have the accountability and would look to turn it back as quickly as possible. A parallel, Mr. Chairman, I don't remember if you made it earlier, but a parallel was, we have the same thing when a school board doesn't perform and puts their graduates in jeopardy of their diploma not being, accredited to get into a college. That has happened at least once since I've been down here. And I think history says the state got out of that business just as fast as it could and turned it back over to the county. I would hope that would be here, but your point's well made.
Sure.
I just think we all can agree that it just, I guess it sets me off a little bit sometimes when we get into it's as if it's our money. It's not my money. It's not your money. It's the county. It's those people.
I understand.
And our credibility, we've got to work together to deliver a better result. I know you work hard for it, and I appreciate it.
I totally understand that. And again, I think the main concern there is if those who are funding it are not responsible for it, there's no incentive to be effective, efficient, or do that, other than, they maybe want to get out of it, but that lack of direct connection or correlation between the two does cause concern. But ultimately, yes, it is the taxpayers.
Any other questions, Mr. Edwards? Did you have any other comments?
No, I just wanted to thank y'all. These are complex bills. I know the state and the nation's attention are on this. We want to continue working with y'all to perfect them, and as we go through the process.
If you have any particular language regarding 493, I know you mentioned some language from a Senate bill.
Yes, sir.
If you have any particular language, I certainly would have welcomed you sharing that at any point during this, since we dropped it, and now if you have it.
I didn't, other than referencing the provisions of that bill that we appreciate, and I'll make sure I get that too.
Yeah, because I certainly want to work with you and continue these discussions. I know I had spoken with Mr. Mueller early on when we dropped these to give him, notice that they were coming. And
you did, and we appreciate that.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I know Representative Roberts is here and was going to speak to a bill that is not on the agenda, but 501 is a bill that we have in committee. Oh, okay. You didn't light up. Yes, please.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make a clear statement. I am from Clayton County, and Clayton County did lose their accreditation. However, our children did attend college. The fact that they lost their accreditation, our superintendent at that time secured another accreditation source for us. And so several children, they received the Gateway Scholarship. So they did. So in that reference to say that this bill is designed like that. I wanted to make that clear. While we did have some issues with our school board, our school system did continue to work. And with that being said, how would a county be able to appeal a decision from the state board to take over?
Well, I think that's what Ms. Marks was speaking to, is that she would, like to see some sort of judicial review, whether that's, and right now it would be part of the investigation and the hearings at the SEB. And I think, again, that's what she's speaking to, is she'd like to see some additional judicial review for the process before it came to fruition.
Okay. And then also the problem I have with this is when you start talking about taking something away, the impact that it's going to have on those residents that live there. And so is the state election board or whoever, are they going to come meet, talk to them? Because when you start talking about taking something away from a county, it does have a direct effect on those residents.
Well, I think, with all due respect, I think the 18-month limit is intended, not to be a takeaway, but is to, intervene, do the things that Mr. Edwards talked about, train, get everybody back up to speed, and then turn it back over. It's not to go in and fire everybody and start fresh and disrupt everything. It's intended for somebody to go in with some administrative capability that knows, how to help in situations where counties are having a difficult time. And, again, it has to go through a very involved investigative process. I think if you read the bill, again, it talks about an additional hearing beyond that, and then a vote of the board in order to enact. And I think from a retribution standpoint, I think having 492 in place where you have an independent elected chairperson, I think that does help with regards to the fear of a potential retribution component at the Secretary of State level. And that's not an accusation of anybody, just the potential with regards to that. And I think that was brought up earlier.
And just one other comment. I know that we keep using the words over and over again, restore confidence, but a lot of what we're doing right now is not necessarily restoring confidence. People feel like, a lot is being taken away from them. So I think that when we look at restore confidence, we need to look at what it is that those residents or the citizens of Georgia, what would restore their confidence. I'm not sure that taking away or making a whole lot of different changes doesn't necessarily restore confidence.
Well, I think the intent is to go in, provide additional training to ensure that the chain of custody is in place, to make sure that, the rules and the laws are properly being followed and carried out, and that, the citizens are provided the opportunity. I've seen, I think we had testimony the other day that said, Georgia's one of the easiest states in which to vote. But, if you have confusion, I think going back to June 9th, where we saw a lot of that and people felt disenfranchised. And then you go to November the 3rd, where we had other investigations and people felt like there were a lot of irregularities and that, so forth. Again, these have surfaced, going all the way back, I think even to possibly 2018, where there were some questions about conflicts and so forth. And we've seen a number of lawsuits brought forward from both sides of the aisle, really. And so, this doesn't target any one particular party. This is actually just targeting counties that are struggling to provide the people the proper ability, access, and support regarding voting. So
Thank you.
I appreciate it. We've worked together for a couple of years now, and I certainly appreciate your perspective, Representative Bernal. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Thank you.
Representative Roberts.
Did you have copies of this one or no?
I think we may need copies of House Bill 501. Ms. Roberts asked if we had some time that maybe we hear this bill as well. And Representative Roberts, I'm going to turn the floor over to you to explain House Bill 501. It's, I think, intended to reinforce what we have.
Correct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. I hope this one will be a little bit less controversial. HB 501 is very simple. It clarifies the original intent of this body when they passed HB 316 for the voting machines. Currently, the official vote for the ballot marking devices is the QR code, but if any recount was requested or required, it's supposed to be a hand count of the text portion of the ballot. I believe Chairman Blackmon actually carried the amendment during HB 316. I wasn't in the legislature at that time, but I did attend every single hearing, so I remember it well. So even though this was the intent, the law must be a little bit ambiguous because our state election board adopted an emergency rule that required recounts be a simple rescan of the QR code. And just like we've argued with the old DREs that had no paper ballot whatsoever, recounts were kind of pointless because they just pulled the same counts from the computer and had nothing to compare it to. So rescanning the barcode, as the state election board has suggested with its emergency rule, is exactly the same problem. You and I can't read QR code. And so this just embodies and codifies what was originally intended for the recount. I know some people may say, well, a risk limiting audit would do this, but technically those aren't required for another couple of years, and they're only required in one race. It doesn't say which race. They're only required every 2 years. And it only checks the outcome. It doesn't change the actual vote count. And so recount applies to every candidate in every race. And it doesn't, I mean, we didn't have very many recounts. Obviously, we had a very large voluntary hand audit this year, but I think this will give voters and candidates confidence that we can compare the computers to the text portion. So I would ask for your favorable support on this. Thank you.
Well, Ms. Roberts, you're right. I think we had a very kind of inclusive opportunity to make the human readable text, part of the law regarding those printed ballots by BMDs. And so this would just do, I think what the secretary ordered back from November 3rd on that particular vote would allow a hand recount in the instance of a recount versus machine recount. Is that? Well, I was just going to say, am I correct in saying that the hand recount?
The current provision, the current way it's conducted is if you do a recount, what you do is you create a batch. So let's say you take 100 ballots and candidate A got 53 votes, candidate B got 47. You physically look at the text on the ballot, confirm that's the case. Then you run it through the scanner, and if it comes back 5347, then you know that your batch is correct. It is scanning the QR code correctly. That's how a recount is currently conducted. So it's not just reading the QR code. You confirm that the batch is correct to the QR code to conduct.
Are those recounts done? The other provision of this bill is to provide for oversight of the recount. Was that done? Is that currently done?
I need to look at the text more closely to be able to.
Okay, so the other additional portion that we added in was essentially to provide a process by which both parties and candidates could be present to watch the recount. So,
Thank you, Representative Roberts. We've got, this is initial hearing for these bills. So, I know there's some suggestions and a few tweaks that have been asked for. So we'll try to entertain those and hopefully bring them back to subcommittee for action at that point. Mr. Edwards, you had a.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for not. Can you hear me okay?
Go ahead. Yes.
I'm Todd Edwards with the ACCG. I apologize for not having that bill and being prepared to speak on it to committee. But if I'm understanding the concept is for every recount going forward, I guess it's within 5 percentage points of difference, that this is to be an entire hand recount and not just reading the code or scanning them through the machine, entirely hand recount?
Well, it's supposed to be done via the human readable text versus just a strict recount based on the QR code.
We have not taken a position, but I can tell you from the election officials that I talked to, the biggest source of errors in any of this process is actually having hands, eyes, and human interaction within the process. And if we talked about confidence, in elections, this may have the opposite unintended
Well,
impact.
I think one of the things that gave people a lot of added confidence was the hand recount back on from the November 3rd election. And so, as something that, would I guess reinforce that process. I think that was a confidence builder to a great degree. But appreciate the comments, Mr. Edwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We do have a comment from Chairman Martin.
Chairman, you really covered what I was going to say. Is the thing I heard in 316 is, it's not a handwritten ballot because I don't know what the QRC code says. We were very clear to people that you see, candidate A, candidate B on the ballot. And if you see that, if there's a question later on, we will count those for you. So I understand it takes a bit. I understand we love our fellow man, but we're more apt to make human errors than the computer is.
Certainly.
If the computer is right. The reality of it is, as Sam said from the Secretary of State's office, when you see a batch and it says 5743, and you counted that with your eyes and 2 or 3 people and you run it through, then you get a belief into the machine. So I understand if it were only hand counts where you would be, but I agree. And I've got to go to rules as I see Chairman Smyrie getting up as well. But I would ask the Secretary of State to consider almost a video to show how that's done. And so Georgians can see that, because I know how it's done. You know how it's done. Everybody in this room may know how it's done. There are a lot of our electors that still don't understand that that's exactly the process that went by. Anyone that we could show that, I'd pick a random box and run those batches. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Please excuse me to rules.
Thank you. If there's nothing further from any members of the committee, we will stand adjourned. Thank you so much.